Three, two, one, here we go. Rainman's Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also, interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey, everybody, it's the Rain Man. Welcome back. I want to welcome in my guest and friend, Joe Connell. Joe's been on a couple of times, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So, Joe, how you doing today?
Very well, thanks, Brian, and thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. As a quick refresher for those of you who don't know, Joe is a Irish historian. Has written several books about the Irish War of Independence in the late 19 teens to early 1920s, of which one of his better books was The Terror War, about just how both the English side and the Irish side, how they went at that war. It was a very, very interesting book. He's also written heavily on Michael Collins and the assassination of Michael Collins. So I wanted to have Joe on for a very important reason. But before we get going, if you are part of Rain Man's Take, thank you very much. If you're new to the program, welcome. I know you're going to love the content. So go ahead and if you could hit that subscribe button at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if you could watch this video to the end, that would really help me out with the algorithm, with the YouTube algorithm, which in turn lets me get this out to more people and really get the conversation going. So with that being said, early in February, I guess it was early this year, there was a historic vote that took place in Northern Ireland. And I'll just read a little bit from this article that I have here. And then what I want to do with you, Joe, is kind of get into the historical context of this, what led up to this over the last couple hundred years of Irish history, because it does have the ability to really move things in an incredible new direction for Ireland. So the article is titled, "Who is Michelle O'Neill, Northern Ireland's incoming First Minister?" And this was from February 2nd of this year from Reuters. In Belfast, Michelle O'Neill will become the new leader of the Northern Ireland's regional government on Saturday, the most significant milestone yet in the shift to a new generation of Irish nationalists not directly involved in the region's decades-long bloody conflict. O'Neill, 47, represents Sinn Fein, the former political wing of the Irish Republican Army, which campaigns on both sides of the Irish border for an end to British rule in Northern Ireland and the creation of a united Ireland. Her formal appointment as First Minister of Northern Ireland will end a long wait since Sinn Féin's unprecedented May 2022 electoral victory and comes after the British government struck a deal this week with the pro-British Democratic Unionist Party, whose assent is required under the region's power sharing arrangements. So that is what happened recently, and it has the potential to really stir things up as it relates to a unified Ireland and Ireland's relationship with the United Kingdom. And so, Joe, why don't we go ahead and kind of give me your take on that election, and then let's start in on kind of the historical context and what got us to this point.
First of all, it's an extraordinarily important election that she is now the first minister. She's the first nationalist first minister in Northern Ireland ever in 100 years. So it's an extraordinarily important point at this time. We'll talk about how she got there, and you have to take a look at all of these things about the nuances that go along with them, because whenever you read that article, and I didn't read that article, but I read a lot of them when she was elected, from the New York Times to the London Times to the Belfast Telegraph. And after those first few paragraphs, they all usually went out to the idea of, now, does this mean that we'll have a united Ireland? Yeah. So as you go through the articles, you say, well, is this really a step toward united Ireland? We'll talk about that, I hope. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think those kinds of discussions are premature right here. And even she has kind of said they're premature because when we talk about Northern Ireland, we talk about a border. But why is there a border? Why is there even a Northern Ireland? What is this? You told me before that you've gone up there and there really wasn't a border. You would not have known that you went from the Republic of Ireland to the north of Ireland, except for two things. There would be billboards saying, here's where you can change your money from euros to pounds.
Right.
And you notice that petrol changed in terms of liters to gallons. So from that point of view, you would not have known when you went from one side to the other, but we'll talk about what the effect of Brexit had on doing it. So how did this border come about and what's it all about? It really starts at the very end of the 19th century when the Irish nationalists started looking for home rule. They've been ruled out of Dublin, out of London rather, since the first part of the 1801, and they wanted to get to home rule, and home rule scared the Protestants. They had a great deal of fear of the Catholics taking over. But we'll see all through today, it's not one-sided. Because in 1850, the Catholic Cardinal Paul Cullen said, I would never trust a Protestant, and I've never even dined with one. So when we talk about one side or the other, it's not one side, it's both sides pointing their fingers at each other. And that's how we get to a Northern Ireland. It starts with this concept of home rule. And the first home rule bill was in 1887. That was when Gladstone was the prime minister of Great Britain. He really thought that Ireland could deserve home rule. And you had Charles Stewart Parnell on the Irish side. Charles Stewart Parnell had some personal problems. He was out. The bill passed, but then the House of Lords turned it down. The second home rule bill was in 1893. It passed again in Commons, and the House of Lords again turned it down. But in 1893, they mentioned for the first time the concept of partition, a border, Northern Ireland. Then in 1912, they changed the rules so the House of Lords could only turn down a motion out of the House of Commons twice. And then in 1912 and 1914, they passed the third home rule bill. And they, at that time, they said they might have a partition. But here's how we start to see the changes. Lloyd George, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at that time, told Edward Carson, who was the head of the Unionists in the North, that any partition would be permanent. But he told John Redmond, who was the head of the Nationalists in the South, that any partition would be temporary. So you get this situation where they're telling one side one thing, the other side another thing. And Winston Churchill at the time said, we can't let the North dictate to the whole Ireland. So all of a sudden you've got partition, you got in there. In 1912, there's a strange series of events. There's the Ulster Covenant, which they signed. 500,000 people signed it. Some of them signed it in their own blood, saying, we will not leave the United Kingdom. Then they established the Ulster Volunteers. Very paradoxically, the Ulster Volunteers were to fight the British Army to stay in the United Kingdom. And then they had the volunteers in the South saying, no, we'll fight the Ulster Volunteers to get out and home rule. So you've got back and forth. It's a very strange kind of a thing. A long time ago, Margaret Thatcher once described the Irish border as 500 kilometers with 200 crossings. But she said, look at this. It's just nothing but kinks and wrinkles. Well, kinks and wrinkles don't just describe the border, they describe the politics too. And that's where we start and get into partition and why we can take a look and see why there really is a Northern Ireland.
So the only thing that I really know, other than, like you said earlier, that we've been there before, if my history is correct, the reason why, one of the main reasons why Churchill wanted to keep Northern Ireland was the shipbuilding and the harbor at Belfast. Is that correct? Because that was that and also the textiles that were coming out of Northern Ireland to help clothe the British soldiers, and then the shipbuilding, which anecdotally the Titanic was built in Belfast. But was that the main reason why he wanted it?
Yes, as the Irish War of Independence started in 1919, we've talked about that before. You've got that on your channel there. And in 1921, they went to have a conference to negotiate an Anglo-Irish treaty to end the War of Independence. At that time, what they did was they had already passed the fourth Home Rule Bill at the end of 1920, and it partitioned Ireland. It defined this border we're talking about, the 500-kilometer border. And what that did was it took the border of Ireland out of British politics. Didn't do anything for the Irish, but it took it off the table for British politics. And as a result, they felt they could go then, the British could go and negotiate with the people in the south of Ireland. They did negotiate that. And among the provisions, which we'll talk about here in a minute, of that treaty were that there were 3 treaty ports, as they were called, that the British maintained over those years. And then in 1938, I'm jumping ahead here, but I'll catch up in a minute. In 1938, the British did give those ports back to Ireland, and they took over their control, which drove Churchill nuts because he saw the war coming and he knew exactly that he wanted those ports. We'll talk about him here in a minute again. Churchill goes back and forth on here, and he was always on one side or the other, and you could never kind of tell exactly what's going on. But at the end of that Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, they had this border, and then they had to determine what exactly was going to be the parameters of that border, and they came up with a border commission. And the border commission was supposed to take a look and see, should we change it? Should we move it in any particular way? We've got 6 counties in the north. Is this right or wrong? And they did negotiate for a while. The Irish, the Southern Irish thought that they were going to get some property back from the north. The British thought that the border commission was going to go one way or the other. And basically when it it moved some property a little bit north and a little bit south. So the president of Ireland's executive council at the time, W.C. Cosgrave, went over to London to negotiate, and they negotiated another part of the treaty which said that we will keep the border just as it is, but we will no longer be responsible for any of the British war debt out of the First World War. It could be said that the Southern Irish sold the northern border in order to relieve themselves of that war debt. But they were just coming out of a civil war. They had no money. They took this as it. But Cosgrave knew this would be a problem. He went back to the Parliament in Dublin and said, we want to make sure nobody knows about this. This report should be burned or buried, and nobody would find out about it. They did. They buried it until 1969, and nobody knew exactly how the border was done. But now we have the border. Now we have partition. Now we have a separate entity in the north, and that's where we come up with Northern Ireland for the next 100 years.
And that obviously the majority of people will know about the troubles in the 70s and the 80s with the IRA and the bombings and all of those really, really high profile conflicts that were going on between the British and the Irish. So obviously the IRA are the Irish Republican Army, like we said earlier, is Sinn Fein. Those are the Republicans. Those are the Catholics, and then the northern is it the Democratic Unionists? They are all Protestants, and that has been going on for hundreds of years. Talk a little bit. Let's kind of fast forward to in your historical timeline here to kind of towards the end of the 80s, towards the end of the really, really violent fighting between the IRA and the Northern Irish. And then things, at least on the surface, seemed like they were starting to calm down a little bit, like there was starting to be better relations. Is that the case, or has there always been some tension underneath? And then again, that brings us kind of to today. How is that going to impact that moving forward? So kind of talk a little bit about maybe the 70s and 80s, and then kind of how that all kind of settled down.
Let me go ahead and talk about the 1920s just for a second, because we talk about the troubles in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the 19-teens and 1910s or 1920s, it was no less violent in the North than it was in the 70s and 80s. It did calm down a little bit between, say, 1925, 1930, and 1960. But in the 1920s, it was just as violent. There were just as many Catholics who were killed, just as many Protestants, and that sort of thing. So it was there. But if you jump ahead and we look at this concept of Protestants, Unionists, Catholics, it's very important to kind of take a look at how. I mentioned Edward Carson. Edward Carson never wanted partition. James Craig in 1921 was elected to the post of prime minister in the North, and Carson resigned because he didn't want partition. but he cautioned Craig. He said, "We have always said that there are prejudices against us in the South. You should not be prejudiced against Catholics in the North. We must not give them that opportunity." So Craig was quoted and has been said all these years to have said, the North is a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people. But he never said that. He said something close. But it's important to note the difference. He said when he was in a parliamentary debate, one time, he said, in the South, they talk about the Catholics, and here we talk about Protestants. In the South, they talk about a Catholic country. Here we are going to have a Protestant parliament for a Protestant state. Now, that's just a tiny bit different, but it's an important difference. Remember, when you say the movie Casablanca, you think of Humphrey Bogart saying, "Play it again, Sam." He never said that. He said, "Play it, Sam. You played it for me. You can play it for her. You play it for her. You can play it for me." But when you take a look at these things, these statements, they go on with somebody and they're remembered forever. I talked about home rule. One of the things they said in the North was home rule is Rome rule. It really never was. It was never just a concept of Catholics. But when Craig said that in 1934, when they passed the 1937 Constitution in the South, they put the Catholic Church in as a special position. So they could have said this. So yes, you're exactly right. You have Protestants, Unionists, and you have Loyalists. They're all used somewhat interchangeably. They want to stay in the UK. You've got Republicans, Catholics, and Nationalists. They're all kind of the same, and they want to go to United Ireland. But none of these is a monolith. There are Protestants who wouldn't mind going to the South, etc. It's not a religious thing, not at all. The historians have said it's not a religious conflict at this point. Might have been in 1690, but not now. What is now is it's about status, it's about identity, it's about discrimination and fear of it. You mentioned Churchill. I want to just mention one thing about Churchill before we go on. In the start of the Second World War, remember Churchill had the British had given away those treaty ports. Churchill went to the Irish and said, "If you come back on our side and let us use your bases and use your harbors, we will, in principle, come around with a united Ireland in short order." Well, the Irish didn't believe him, and he probably couldn't have done it anyway. On the 8th of December, 1941, Churchill did send a telegraph to the Irish and said, "If you come now, a nation once again," which is one of the great Irish rebel songs, "it's now or never." People have always said that when he sent that telegraph at midnight, he'd been drinking all day long, but who knows whether that's true or not. Could be with Churchill, or it might not be with Churchill. But that's how this developed, and they did not go on. They maintained their neutrality through the Second War. But that does bring us to the time when you're talking about the 70s and 80s, when they start to negotiate in the 60s with regard to the North and the South, trying to bring about some kind of peace and trying to bring about some kind of cooperation between the North and the South.
And was there? I mean, I guess there probably was, because I'm sure it's very similar to what it's like in Jerusalem. The Jews and the Arabs and the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians all kind of got to get along because everybody lives within close confines of each other. But that's not the case in Northern Ireland, because they actually just built a wall around the Catholic sort of enclave of that of Northern Ireland. And so, were they getting along? I mean, I would assume that to be the case. And then just at the political level, national level, you get this idea that they hate each other's guts, and they were, oil and water the entire time.
I think in order to really understand the situation, which was in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, in say the 50s, 60s, and then the 70s, 80s, as you go on, you have to understand the discrimination that was just simply a part of life. There was discrimination in education, discrimination in employment, discrimination in voting. There was discrimination in the police. To this degree, in education, for example, the Catholics did not have a right to education after age 14. So they simply couldn't get any education. The usual thing goes on: you can't have the job because you don't have the education, but I can't get the education, so I can't get the job. Okay? Then there was a combination of housing. About 30% of the people in the North, even today, live in public or social housing. 92% of that housing today is granted on sectarian sites. You're either on the Protestant side or the Catholic side. You've been there. You see the peace walls. If you're going up and down Shankill Road, all you're seeing are murals on the side of the houses that are unionist murals. If you drive up and down the Falls Road, you see murals on the side of the houses that are nationalist kind of thing. So you not only have education, but you have employment. You mentioned Harlan Wolff earlier. And yes, the Titanic was built there. And they'll be happy to tell you when she left here, she was fine. So the fact of the matter is when she was being built, though, they had 10,000 employees. They had 400 Catholics working there. So you had a huge discrimination in employment, and it still remained that way until some about the 80s and 90s when they started bringing some new employment. There was a thing called voting. It was called plural voting at the time. I mentioned you didn't have a right to education. You didn't have the right to vote. You could only vote if you were a ratepayer, that is a taxpayer. So if someone had 4 houses, they got 4 votes. Somebody who rented those houses didn't get a vote. So that plural voting continued until 1970. And in fact, you didn't get that. You would have, for example, the Lord Mayor of Derry, who had 7 houses and 7 buildings, he had 43 votes, and the people who worked for him could not vote. So when they say, well, go to the ballot box, there is no chance. We don't get a chance to vote. As far as the police is concerned, again, we can talk about this a little later, but it was the same sort of a thing. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, as it was called until 2001, was 95% Catholic, 95% Protestant. So in fact, they were always opposed to the Catholics. So the discrimination was there. That was just a fact of life. It wasn't a case of saying we could do this. Let me give you one particular anecdote of myself. I know a lot of people in the North, and I know a guy he was Protestant, his wife was Catholic. Sure, her sister came to the North, and they were going to go for a girls' night out. And I was talking to him, and they said, "Okay, what's her name?" And her name, the sister who lived in the South's name, was Aoife, which is a specific Irish name. It's a kind of a thing that. And they told her, "Not tonight. It isn't. Your name is Lily." Because there's still that discrimination that goes there in very, very nuanced kinds of ways. So that discrimination was there. I don't want to disregard the troubles. I don't want to disregard the fighting in the 20s, but I just wanted, for purposes of this discussion, I think we need to kind of limit it to politics and how things developed and that sort of thing. Because again, it wasn't like they were fighting each other all the time, but it was that they were at loggerheads because the Catholics were so discriminated against, they couldn't go in any other way.
I find that fascinating. It's more like apartheid in South Africa than anything else, and the fact that that's still kind of there to some degree is pretty wild. So what was I would the wall, the enclosure wall around the Catholic sort of enclave up there, it's fascinating. And I think it was you that told me one of the last times we had a conversation was every year they open up the gates and they let the Protestants march through. So there's still, even now in today's modern world, there's still under the current, still a little bit of or a lot of animosity. Is that correct?
Oh, there is. We're coming up to what's called in the North the marching season. The marches in most of the North, in Belfast, for example, are the 12th of July. The marches in Derry and some of the other places are the 12th of August. And the march on the 12th of July is to commemorate the Battle of the Boyne, 1690. And the marches in Derry are to commemorate when the apprentice boys closed the gates and they took over Derry. So yes, they do have these marches, and they march up and down the various kinds of places. I know people who, for example, will leave the North during the marching season just because they don't think it's safe. I'll give you another anecdote. Of course, I don't know him, but Liam Neeson is, of course, a gigantic star right now. He comes from the North. Before he was a movie star, he was a boxer, and he ran. He worked in construction. So this is a big man who can take care of himself. And he said he would never go out on the 12th because he just didn't want to be involved with what was going on. In fact, he was offered, his hometown is Ballymena. He was offered the the freedom of Ballymena once, and he turned it down because he said not yet, and then he did accept it later on. But it's still there, and every August or every July and August there is this marching season, and it's there. As we go along here and we talk about the 80s and 90s and the various agreements that are going on, you can see where things have started to change, and you can see where things are getting better. Better, not perfect, but that's the development.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, it's going to take a long time because you're trying to reverse generations and generations of animosity towards one another. But it did start to change, and I do remember who was the famous Sinn Fein leader of was it probably 20 years ago that really kind of kicked it off and really started to bring Sinn Fein sort of out of the IRA kind of standing into more of a political party. What was his name again?
Well, you're probably talking about Jerry Adams.
Yes, yes.
Who you're talking about. Okay.
Yeah.
If we take a look at the 1970s, the trouble started in 1968, 1969. They were basically the marches and everything that were going on at that particular time were for civil rights. That's what they did. When they were marching and demonstrating, they were singing "We Shall Overcome" and other civil rights anthems. They weren't singing the United Ireland kind of anthems. So they started that. And the British and the Irish government started to look and see if there's a way that they could cooperate. In 1973, they started the Sunningdale Agreement, which was going to recognize some cooperation between the two parties. And actually, that was knocked down to nothing by the Unionists, who objected and said, "No, we don't ever want to negotiate. We don't want any part of this." They called a general strike, which closed the country down. And finally, after about 6 months, Sunningdale was just kind of forgotten. And there was a new Ireland forum in 1974, I believe it was. And this again was a kind of a thing where they were going to try and have some kind of cooperation between them. Margaret Thatcher starts to come in about 1974. And one of the things that you notice when you study this is that I might not agree with a lot of what was said, but you have to understand that a lot of the ways that it was said are really very good oratorical ways of saying things. The New Ireland Forum said that we're going to have maybe a unitary state, or maybe there was going to be a federalist kind of a state with two parliaments or something, or there was going to be some kind of British Irish authority. And Margaret Thatcher had a press conference, and she simply said, a federal state, that's out. A single state, that's out. Any cooperation, that's out. And it became her out, out, out speech. That was it. That's all anybody remembered. And again, when you talk about Ian Paisley later on saying never, 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 their oratorical things were actually fairly good, even though what they said was not very good, in my opinion, wasn't very good. Margaret Thatcher did sign an Anglo-Irish agreement a little later on in about 1985. And each of these agreements is kind of a stepping stone. They look like they might be failures as you look back there because they didn't do anything. But in fact, they started to negotiate and come together, and they wanted to do that. That's why the agreements and the things that went on in the 70s and 80s are so important in a historical context, because they got the parties together to a little bit to try and take a look at it. And also it brought in the Anglo-Irish Agreement was 1985. It also brought in the United States because Ronald Reagan was, of course, the president at the time, but Reagan put a bunch of pressure on the parties, as did Tip O'Neill, as did Daniel Patrick Moynihan, as did Ted Kennedy. So now all of a sudden you see the Americans and the U.S. coming in to try and put pressure on bringing about an agreement. And that's how it always was. It's all the way through these agreements, which you might say, well, they didn't do very much, but they did. They set the stage for the next step.
And so, and then it kind of it culminates somewhere probably in the late 90s, early mid to late 90s, I think. And so let's just come back around to modern day right now, just for a little bit, and then we can bounce back and forth, because the history of what it took to get here is fascinating. So is it in your mind, this election of Michelle O'Neill, whose father was actually part of the IRA in the 70s and the 80s, is it, where do you see this going, and how important is this to the whole dynamic of Northern Ireland and United Ireland?
I think it's hugely important. I think the British have changed again over this time. Historically, the British have changed their position. We think in terms, and very often what you would see were paintings on those peace walls, et cetera, in the North, Brits out. In 1990, the Secretary for Northern Ireland said at the time that Britain no longer has a selfish economic interest in Northern Ireland. That was extraordinarily important, and it was one that was negotiated, that the language, as you can imagine, was negotiated over and over and over again, because that then said the British will allow a united Ireland if it ever happens. Now, we also have to take a look at what are the public and the private negotiations. You mentioned Gerry Adams earlier. Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness and several others went over to London to start negotiations on a private level in 1972. So all the way through, we've got these negotiations that are going on. And in the 80s, you have relationships that start build up, not necessarily with the leaders of the parties, but certainly with the bureaucrats who are the ones who are going to draft the agreements and awarding, et cetera. So all of those are very, very important as we move into the Downing Street Declaration later on in 1993s, and they kind of come there. So in 1998 is the one where you're looking at. That's what's called the Good Friday Agreement, or sometimes called the Belfast Agreement. That's the one that brought priests up there, and that's the one under which Northern Ireland is operating today in terms of its politics and its economy, et cetera. Where it leads, I don't know. And we're going to have to talk about that because, as I said at the very outset, in those articles that you're going to read, every one of them at the very end said, well, this is on the steps to not United Ireland. Well, maybe or maybe not. It kind of depends on it. But certainly the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 it was the catalyst for everything that happened in the last 26 years.
And it's funny that you're saying it that way, because when I first reached out to you a couple months ago, it was right after the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick's, our annual luncheon, and they have as a guest speaker. There's a local bar owner here in San Diego who is a Irish native and lives over here now, and he sort of gives kind of an update of what's going on in Ireland, obviously from the framework of a united Ireland eventually. And so this was the first time I had heard about Michelle O'Neill's election, and the confidence and the excitement in his voice about finally getting out from underneath the English was palpable as he was talking about this. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this all plays out. One more, I just want to get your opinion for the modern where we are today in this, and that is, what is your opinion on the English point of view, the British point of view? Would they be open to that? I mean, where do you think we are with that?
Well, again, after 1990, when the Northern Ireland Secretary said that, everything that has followed that indicates this concept of the concept of Northern Ireland being able to leave when there is consent to do so. We'll talk about the Northern Ireland Secretary, who really has the whole thing in his hands. It's a him right now. He has the whole thing in his hands as to whether they can leave. I would suggest to you that in many, many ways, Great Britain right now would love to see the back of Northern Ireland. And I'd suggest to you that that might be true in the last 100 years. They had to have this agreement with the North in 1921 before they could make an agreement in the South. Everything they've done ever since then, and the Conservatives and the Liberals kind of go back and forth in terms of what is their position on this. The Conservatives have usually been more unionist than the Liberals. But that makes sense because the actual name of the party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. That's the official name of it. And they are in power in Westminster right now. But everything's pointing to maybe a liberal government coming in the next election, which is going to be in the next year. So that's going to have an effect upon it. And we can also take a look at some of the things that the British have said over this time of since 1990, 1998. They would just as soon not get involved in this. They don't want to have government out of Westminster. They want the Northern Irish Assembly to govern itself. So everything they've tried to do is to bring that assembly, which we'll talk about here in a minute, into effect and let them take care of their own problems. And there's one other thing. In the last 100 years, Northern Ireland has never been self-sufficient. In fact, every year the British have to give them somewhere between 10 and 15 billion pounds in order to run their government. The Labour government would love to be able to take that off of their exchequer every year. So would the British stand in the way of this? No, it's going to be consent. It's going to require consent, as we'll talk about in terms of how the agreement, the Good Friday Agreement is. But if the North consents to this and they want to move to the South, the British are not going to stand in the way.
That's a fascinating point you just made there about how they're essentially subsidizing Northern Ireland. Has that always been the case, or because I always was just under the impression that it was that because of the shipbuilding and all the textiles and all those things that Northern Ireland was a pretty successful economically, and that doesn't sound like that was ever the case.
What was the case?
It was
about
okay.
1905, but most of the textile mills, the linen mills, are closed.
Yeah.
Harland and Wolff is now building very small vessels. It's no longer building your liners. Your liners are being built in Indonesia, kind of thing. So, in fact, the Northern Ireland economy, which was huge at the time, and it was much more successful than the Southern Irish economy, is no longer that's the case. So, times have changed. Demographics has changed. Just about everything has changed here since 1921. And they're trying to work off the same agreement that they made in 1921, and a lot of times it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, well, like this article said, Michelle O'Neill is now part of the new generation of leaders that has really no direct connection with all of this conflict that was happening in the 70s, 80s, and then obviously before then as well. Do you have friends in Northern Ireland that are Protestant, and what's their feeling? Would they be open to it, or is there still really that kind of traditional stand of this is ours, Northern Ireland?
The nationalists, the Republicans I know in Northern Ireland have a phrase. It's called Chak Allah, and basically it's our day will come. And they have always said that for 100 years, thinking that there was going to be a united Ireland. And many times that was a hope, it was an aspiration. I think it sometimes is even a dream. They're saying that now with the expectation this might happen, just as you have your friend there in San Diego who's saying the same sort of a thing. As far as the friends that I have that are on the other side of this, there is one of the Irish newspapers has an advice column, and the title of the advice column is "Asking for a Friend," which I think is an absolutely brilliant name for a column, because we all know somebody who's asked us something and saying, "I'm really asking this for a friend," when you know damn well they're asking for themselves. But the people now that I talk to in Northern Ireland, the unionists, who may very well have said 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there is no way that there's ever going to be a united Ireland. Now their answer is, well, I have some friends who are talking about that. So again, a very nuanced kind of a change that's there. I don't think the hardcore unionists are ever going to agree to it any more than the hardcore nationalists were ever going to agree to being in the North. But you're going to have, we can talk as we get into this concept of United Ireland, we can talk about some of the problems, some of the methods that may be used, etc. And you have to take a look at this and think, there are people now on both sides who are at least thinking that somewhere in the foreseeable or the nebulous, however you want to take a look at that future, they're looking at this thinking maybe there's going to be United Ireland. And as I said before, I don't think the British are going to stand in the way one bit. I think they want out.
Yeah, I mean, the whole world is changing. This is happening all across the world, and it's I keep telling my nephews that we are living in truly historic times, and and Ireland is just a little piece of that, but it's happening everywhere. What are you currently working on? Any new books, or what are you
Well, I think I'm going
working
to
on?
work on a compendium of things of columns that I've written. Let me just kind of we'll take a look before we actually get into the concept of United Ireland. one of the things that we have to talk about, which has had a tremendous effect upon this, and actually goes back to the concept of Michelle O'Neill and everything else, is this concept that you and I have talked about before, Brexit. Brexit changed everything in the North. It absolutely changed everything. You see that in the politics. You see that in the election, the number of seats that each party has. You see that in percentages. You see everything. It absolutely changed the concept of the North and what's happening. Because as Brexit took over, remember, the North voted to remain. They voted 55% to 44% to remain. However, the Unionists voted to leave. So again, you have this concept of which side is this, and you're thinking, well, everybody's going to vote their pocketbook, but they didn't. They would rather stay in the European, the United Kingdom, than stay in the EU. But that's changed, and it's caused some great problems in terms of the Brexit agreement, the Northern Protocol, all the things that we can talk about have had great effects upon Northern Ireland, because what the Northern Unionists are saying is, with all these agreements that Britain has made with the EU, it's treating Northern Ireland differently than the rest of the United Kingdom. And they're right. It did. And that's a problem, because how else are you going to do it? Brexit changed everything in the North, and it's going to continue to change as it goes on. And I think that that's going to be something that, as we look at this 5 years from now, you're going to see some of the results of Brexit are all still going to be there.
It's interesting. One thing you just said that I just want to touch on real quick, because I honestly don't have any idea about this. You'd said that all the agreements that the UK has made with the European Union, they would treat Northern Ireland differently if England or if the UK leaves the European Union. You think that everybody would treat Northern Ireland differently, even though they're still essentially part of the UK? Is that what you were just getting at?
Yeah, when the UK left, the only land border that they had with any European Union country was with Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. When the Republic of Ireland and the UK are both members of the EU, there was no border. Probably when you were there, you saw no border. Since 1973, you had nothing. You went back and forth, and if you were going to sell your sausage in Belfast and you made it in Dublin, that was fine. You just simply went up there. The rules for manufacturing were the same in both countries. The rules for transportation were the same in both countries. There was no border. There were no customs declarations. There was no customs paperwork. With the EU leave, or with the UK leaving the EU, they said, we want to make sure that if something is made in London and it goes to Belfast, it doesn't end up back in Dublin. It doesn't go across those borders without any. So they put in customs checks. They put in paperwork. They put in everything. So there was, when it first started, if in fact you made sausage in London, you couldn't sell it in Belfast without customs checks. But if you made sausage in Dublin, you could sell it. So again, the EU changed everything. And this changed people's attitudes. It changed the entire concept of what's going on in the North. And so now they've had various things. They had the Northern Protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol. They've had the Windsor Framework. They've tried to make these things less offensive, less obtrusive in terms of customs, etc. But still, the fact of the matter is, you've got to have some kind of customs. And so now what they're saying is, okay, we got a red lane and a green lane. If the product is coming from London and it's going to stay in Belfast, well, we'll kind of get we'll eliminate the customs checks. But if it's going to go to Belfast and part of it may end up back in Dublin, now it's going to go into another different customs check. So they're trying to do all these things. That agreement, which enabled Michelle O'Neill to be elected, was an agreement between the DUP and London on reducing some of the customs checks. And then the DUP said, okay, it looks like we've reduced all we can for right now, so we will go back into the assembly, which we can talk about in a second, and that will allow us to elect our new first minister. If it weren't for that agreement in January, you would not see for Michelle O'Neill as the first minister.
Excuse me, sorry about that. That is fascinating. I never thought about it in that regard, that it would be an EU Northern Ireland border right there. That blows Okay, so let's get into that. Let's get into this what you were just talking about there, and why did that bring about her her election or her popularity?
All right, let's talk about the Northern Ireland Assembly. That was established in the Good Friday Agreement, and what it said was we're going to have an assembly of all the parties, and there are various unionist parties and various nationalist parties. Everyone will be elected to this assembly. The party that has the most seats in each of the parties has to declare whether they're unionist or nationalist or they're not affiliated. The party that has the most seats between unionists and nationalists will have the first minister. The party has a second, the other party gets the deputy first minister. Both of those are equal. However, there is the name first minister and deputy first minister. Symbols in Northern Ireland mean everything. Michelle O'Neill was the deputy first minister, but now she's the first minister, and you switched them around and you said, all right, this is very, very important. This Northern Ireland Assembly was established in 1998. It's now been in existence, obviously, for 26 years. It's been out and it's been suspended for 40% of the time. Because if one of the parties says, I don't like this, I'm going to resign as first minister, the other minister has to resign as well. And they don't go back into office until they did it. So when they had the election of 2022, which you mentioned at the very outset, they had not been sitting in Parliament because the DUP would not sit in Parliament until they made another deal on Brexit. And that's the thing. Now, a great many people said that they knew, the DUP knew that Jeffrey Donaldson, who was the leader of the DUP, knew that in fact they didn't want to have a nationalist first minister. So in addition to Brexit, there were these other little symbolic kind of things that go with it. But really, it was a concept of making another deal in terms of Brexit. Then, in end of last year, they started negotiating, and in January of this year, they said, okay, we've got a deal. February, she was elected. And you're right. She's 47. She's got a past track record. She was a mayor. She was actually born in Cork, but she was a mayor in Dungannon. She came up through the ranks. She's been a member of. She's been the protege, really, of Martin McGuinness, and she's been in the Northern Ireland Assembly for quite some time. When they nominate her, then the unionists have to nominate somebody to be the deputy first minister, and that's a lady by the name of Emma Little Pengali. She too is young. She's about 44. And you mentioned before about the fact that although Michelle O'Neill is another generation out of the Troubles, her father and one of her cousins was actually killed in the Troubles. Emma Pengali's father was in jail for many years for trying to smuggle guns into Northern Ireland for the DUP. So yes, they are out of the actual facts, the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, but the families are still kind of there, and you have that sort of a thing. But it's very important to take a look at what's happened here. Is you have these elections in the North about every 5 years. Usually the law says you have to have an election every 5 years. So there was an election in, say, 2011. There was one in 2017. And there was this one in 2022. But it's very interesting to take a look at this. In fact, Sinn Fein is not having a gigantic increase in terms of their representation. In fact, if you go back to 2011, the DUP had 38 seats and Sinn Fein had 29. So they were very far apart. Then Brexit happens, 2016. In 2017, they have an election. And in fact, Sinn Fein only has 25 seats and the DUP has 27. And then you get to the 2022 election, and in fact, yes, Sinn Fein now has 27 seats, and the DUP has 25. That's how Michelle O'Neill is the first minister. But where's the party that's really making a change here in terms of it? The Alliance Party, the one that they do not have to define themselves as either nationalist or unionist. In 2011, they had 7 seats. And in 2022, they had 19. That's the big winner here, is that the Alliance Party is really coming up because a lot of people are saying, I don't want to vote for this side or that side. I want to vote in the middle.
and that alliance party, which I've never heard of before, so that thank you for that. Will they be sort of the catalyst that brings about the reunification of Ireland? Do you think, or I mean, I assume is I guess in our American politics, you'd call them the independent, sort of the independent middle. The bigger that gets, the more people seem to be, uh, well, maybe not, but if they get bigger and more popular, will that help to kind of move it towards a unified Ireland?
Good Friday Agreement, 1998, 26 years ago, says that the first minister and the deputy first minister will come from either a nationalist or a unionist. They never figured that the Alliance Party, which was involved in the Good Friday Agreement, would ever come to the top. They really didn't figure that the nationalists would come to that point of view. And so, therefore, the Good Friday Agreement does not allow a position in terms of first minister or deputy first minister, except if you have declared your allegiance to one of those two parties. So, yes, I think that the Alliance Party is going to be very important here as you go forward, but you don't really know exactly what's going on here. For the first time, I think it was 2022, Catholics outnumber Protestants in the North, but it's like 46 to 44%. And when you take a look at it, that still leaves a whole number of people who aren't there. When you take a look at the current trends as to what's going to happen, it's hard to say because, again, the Good Friday Agreement gave the entire ability to determine if there's going to be a border patrol a border poll rather, to the Northern Ireland Secretary. And that Northern Ireland Secretary can call for a border poll when it appears to him that a majority of people might vote for this. With all of these agreements, there's a defined and an accepted ambiguity. If you put things in black and white, nobody will sign up to it. So who knows exactly what that means? The latest polls in December of 2023 by the Irish Times in the North said that 34% want a united Ireland, 50% want to stay in the United Kingdom. All right, now what? Well, the other 15 or 20% are your independents who don't know, who either wouldn't give you an answer or whatever else. In the South, in that same poll, it was yes, 64% and no, 15%. But again, what about the other 30%? It has to be passed in both the North and the South in order for it to be that. As I said to you, I don't think that the British would ever stand in the way, but it's entirely up to the British Northern Secretary as to whether that person wants to go ahead and call for this or not. One of the other things you may have seen in those articles that you're reading was at the very time, remember, Michelle O'Neill is the first minister, but she's the vice president of Sinn Fein overall in terms of Ireland. The president is a lady by the name of, boy, name just escapes me right here for a second. How can I think of this? Hold on here for a second. It's important because she says it. Her name is Mary Lou McDonald. I don't know why I was scoping out, but the president of Sinn Fein throughout is Mary Lou McDonald. So as soon as Michelle O'Neill is elected to the first minister, Mary Lou McDonald says a united Ireland is now within reach. To which Jeffrey Donaldson immediately answers, she's got the longest arms in Ireland. It's just not necessarily there. And it's entirely up to the Northern Ireland Secretary to call a vote or not call a vote. And if he or she, as it might be at the time, wants to do it. But you're not seeing a massive change of people running over to Sinn Fein. You're going from 29 votes to 27 votes over 15 years. That Alliance Party is where the real numbers are changing. So yes, Northern Ireland is definitely in a situation of transition, but still you've got people on the unionist side who will never accept a united Ireland. You've got people on a national side who never did accept the Northern Ireland. But we're seeing a lessening of hostility. We're seeing a lessening of fear. Somebody once phrased it as a softening of the panic. And I think that's what's happening here in the North, is that people are looking at this in a little different way. But there's another thing too. It's always been a zero-sum kind of a concept in the North. You never had any kind of equality. In 2001, there was a patent commission which said that when the commission wanted to put out a troll for new people coming into the police, it was going to be 50% Catholic and 50% Protestant. They were going to try and bring about equality that way. When I would talk to unionists, they would say, we lost 50 seats. When you talk to nationalists, they'd say, we gained 50 seats. It was always on one side or the other. And we have to have this integration now. We have to come to where it's a win-win situation, not a we lose or we gain or anything else. And it's very tribal up there. It's very one side or the other. It's us against them. But we have to have this integration in schools and everything else. I didn't mention earlier in the schools are almost always in the North segregated. 92% of the schools in the North are one religion or the other. So you can go from age 4 to age 18 and never talk to somebody on the other side. Never. You've got to change that so that when people start going and integrate and they start seeing that there's not, the people over there don't really have horns and the people over here don't really have fangs, then you can see a change that's going on.
All right. So you teed this up before we kicked the podcast off. You wanted me to just ask you real quick about this individual, and you just mentioned him, Donaldson. Before I hand it off to you, is he in that position in the North to say, okay, it's time to do that poll? Is that the position that he holds in Northern Ireland?
The man who resigned today is Jeffrey Donaldson, and he was the head of the DUP.
Gotcha.
And they don't think there's going to be any change here. Jeffrey Donaldson was instrumental in getting these new agreements through with regard to the British in regard to Brexit. They don't think there's going to be any change with that. But in Northern Ireland, as you can see, I mean, this goes back to Margaret Thatcher and her kinks and wrinkles. You never really know exactly what's going to happen and what little kind of things are going to take place. I think that right now what's going to happen, and they seem to be doing a very good job of it, is that Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pagali are doing the right things, and they want to get back and have the Northern Ireland Assembly meet. They want to do their jobs as legislators. They want to try and help the National Health Service, which is very important in the North, and just got completely devastated with COVID. They want to do these things, and I think they're taking it slowly. I'm not sure they're looking at a united Ireland, but I think that some people from the outside are looking at United Ireland, and I think that's very premature. I just, as I said, I think the British would love to see the back of Northern Ireland. I think that they're not going to stand in the way of it or anything else. But even though when Brexit changed everything, it made them all take a look and say, now where are we going to go with this? There are just many, many aspects to it. And I think when they do come up with a border poll, Brexit is maybe the best example they could have. They could look at Brexit and say, did the people in Britain really understand on which they were voting overall, or was it just an emotional leave or remain vote? Because that's the same kind of a thing, a binary vote that it would be in Northern Ireland. But I think they have to determine, and we'll talk about here for a few minutes, exactly what does a Northern Ireland mean? What's it going to look like? How are we going to change things? We're not just going to go one day and paint over the marquee there at the gas station and say, now we're going to get gallons into liters. It's much, much more than that. And I think we have to take a look at that before we can really understand exactly what a Northern Ireland combination would mean.
It's fascinating you say that, because as you're talking about that, the first thing that comes to my mind is the murals on the sides of the houses on both sides of the issue. What would happen to those people? What would happen to those? I mean, that becomes ancient history, and probably they would have to do away with that in order to potentially try to move forward. But I mean, it seemed like it was pretty entrenched when we were there.
I'm not sure I want to be the one that somebody says, go over there on that side of the wall or go over there on that side of the wall and paint out the murals. I'm not sure I want to be that person. Remember, all of these things, when you're talking about negotiation, we're talking about Brexit, we're talking about United Ireland, the phrase is always the devil's in the details. And it is, because in fact, what exactly happens here in the North and in the South? How do we go with this? In the South, you're saying, okay, you're going to have a lot of people in the North who still don't want a united Ireland. Even if it passes 60 to 40, you're still going to have a lot of people who don't want a united Ireland. In the North, you're saying to a lot of people, Well, do you want to go down there? And people have said, no, I really don't. Arlene Foster, who preceded Jeffrey Donaldson as a leader of the DUP, was asked what will happen if there's United Ireland. She said, I'll leave. And maybe she can, maybe she will, but there are a lot of people that. Now, you and I know that in the United States, we've had elections for the last 25 years, and somebody always goes on a TV and says, if so-and-so is elected, I'm going to move out. Well, they don't move out. But I don't think many would move out in Northern Ireland either, but they might because it's a different kind of a situation there. I just think we have to take a look and say, what exactly does this mean to go to United Ireland? It's not just a simple thing that we're going to vote on it one day. It really has to be planned and organized, and it has to, all the groundwork has to be laid, which it was not laid in Brexit. That's why they have the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol, et cetera. It was not there. So that should be a very much of a template for us. How do we do this? How do we bring this about with the least conflict possible?
And are those, do you know if those conversations are taking place, those meetings are taking place?
I think there's always conversations that are taking place, but I think you have to kind of take a look and say, what would a Northern Ireland really look like? Suppose there's going to be a federal Ireland. Suppose you're going to have a assembly in Belfast and one in Dublin. Would those people in Belfast be able to retain their British passports? What happens to the VAT, which is different in Northern Ireland and different in the South, or the NHS, which is entirely different in the North than the health service in the South? What happens to this excessively large public service in Northern Ireland? What are we going to do with that? What about social welfare? What about the various concepts of things that go on? What about the symbols? Are we going to have a new flag? Are we going to have a new? Is there going to be something different in terms of amendments to the Constitution? The rugby team in Ireland is a combination of those players from the Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And they have an anthem called Ireland's Call, which is now played instead of the national anthems. This is very important. They brought this out in 1995 for the World Cup. It took years for people to accept this. They didn't want this. We talk about symbols and we say, okay, those are just little things. In 2013, the United States sent over a gentleman by the name of Richard Haas, and he was going to negotiate between the parties because there were riots, there were demonstrations at the time about when flags could be flown on British buildings. So symbols are extraordinarily important up there. And the Border Poll has to take into consideration this concept of what is Northern Ireland going to look like? What are people going to think about? What are they going to say? If we just say yes, no, and then we try and make the determination thereafter of the details, it's going to look just like Brexit, where you're going, no, I'm not so sure about that, and you're going to have problems.
You know, and I'm glad we're having this conversation because it never even occurred to me to think of how difficult that's. I mean, it's essentially like putting the North and the South back together again after the U.S. Civil War. You know, their worlds are so different. How do you meld them back together? Let me. We're coming up here on the time. Let's bring it back now to the people that were fighting the revolution and the War of Independence, 1919, 1920-ish, all those people back then, the Michael Collinses. What would they be thinking about where we stand right now in modern Ireland? I mean, is that what they wanted? Is this just what's your take on that, being the historian, kind of looking through their eyes as to what is going on right now?
Collins always said that the Anglo-Irish Treaty was a stepping stone. That was the term that he used. It was the freedom to achieve freedom, and he was very involved, much more so than the rest of the government at the time before he was killed. Very involved in trying to fight in the North. I think he was wrong in trying to fight in the North at the time. I think that was a wrong thing for him to try and do. But knowing Collins a little bit and seeing how he did, his idea now would be make a deal. He would say, somehow make a deal, make this work, see what we need to do this. You're in a situation where you're going to have to try and find a way that you can assimilate the North or whatever else. You take a look, I mentioned the public service, for example. In the North, 28% of the people working employment are working in the public service. That's extraordinarily high. In the rest of the UK, it's only 16%. In Ireland, it's only 14%. You know, for comparison purposes, in the United States, it's 15%. What do you do with that other 15%? I said before that the British have been funding the Northern Ireland ever since it very started. What do you do about that? There's a new generation in the North right now. It's a generation that sees the EU maybe as more important to them in their lives than anybody else has seen before. Remember, Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU. The young people voted to remain. There are a lot of people in the North who look upon a united Europe as more important than a united Ireland or a united Kingdom. They would rather be in the EU. They study there, they travel there, they get the benefits of it. They look at that. Where is that going to be? In fact, you're going to have a middle class here, a middle section of the electorate that's going to say this is more important to us than one side or the other. So I think that when all is said and done, and you go back to the very election of Michelle O'Neill, yes, is this another one of Collins' stepping stones? I think it is, but I don't think I think it's precipitous to ask about it right now. I would advise Sinn Fein, go into Parliament, go into your assembly, do your job. Your next election in the North is March of 2027, I believe. Go ahead and see what happens there. There's another election coming up in Great Britain this year. What's going to happen if the Conservatives lose out to Labour? What's going to happen to the various? There's an election in the south of Ireland. It's going to come up here between now and next May, I believe it is, in the south. What's going to happen there? Find out, do your job, do it for 3 years, and talk about it. Do the planning as you suggest of a united Ireland, and see what happens, and see where the polls start to be in a year or 2 or 3. Not right now.
Man, that is fascinating, because I went into this interview thinking like, wow, within the next couple of years we could actually see this come to fruition, but they've got a long way to go. And like you said, it's a stepping stone in the right direction, or is it? We'll see. We'll see how it all plays out. All right, sir. I'll give the last couple minutes to you, and kind of give me your just your general outlook on the Ireland of today, as it relates to, or as it is a result of the Ireland over the last couple hundred years. What are your final parting thoughts here today?
I think if you take a look at the Good Friday Agreement, incidentally, if you ask nationalists, it's the Good Friday Agreement. If you talk to the Unionists, it's very often the Belfast Agreement. Again, there's just a little bit of a very bit of a nuanced change. I think it's been extraordinarily important, but there were two parts to that. One is the peace process, and the other is the political process. I think it's been extremely important and extremely successful as far as the peace process is concerned. The political process, not quite so much, because it goes in, it goes out. The assembly is suspended, or it's not. It's certainly better than it ever was. I think it's going in the direction that it should be going. I think it's very important to take a look at this and to determine where it's going to happen. I think we get ahead of ourselves sometimes and say, this is what this election means, or this is what this poll means, and we're putting our own personal opinions into that poll as opposed to what it really means. Sinn Fein is coming up. It's coming up in the north. It's coming up in the south. But the people are going to make a determination in both elections soon. You've just had the prime minister called the Taoiseach in the south resign earlier this week. So you're going to have a new Taoiseach. So you're going to have, what's that going to make a change? I think we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And I think that sometimes they do. And when they get ahead of themselves, sometimes they will alienate the other side as well. So I think we need to just take our time and see how things play out.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm one of those people I'm spring loaded to get all excited when I hear things like this. So it's good to talk to somebody like you to kind of keep me a little bit grounded in some semblance of reality. So I'll tell you what, Joe, this was great as usual. Fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for always having me.
My pleasure. And as we hear more about this over the next couple of years, I'd love to have you back on to get your take on it. And then once you start putting pen to paper again, and you're getting ready to promote books, I'd love to have you on as well.
We'll do that too. Thanks very much, Brian. Thank
All
you.
right. Hey, I'll finish like I always do. If you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. Joe Connell, thank you again. This is the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, Observations on the World We Live In. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.